Good day, time again for today's Living Word. I'm Dwayne Matson. We're continuing in the book of Job, where his friend Eliphaz attempts to speak for God. That's what's going on here in Job chapter 5, beginning at verse 2. He says, "For wrath kills a foolish man, and envy slays a simple one. I have seen the foolish taking root, but suddenly I cursed his dwelling place. His sons are far from safety. They are crushed in the gate, and there is no deliverer. Because the hungry eat up his harvest, taking it even from the thorns. There was nothing left that hadn't been ripped off from Job. And a snare snatches their substance, for affliction does not come from the dust, nor does trouble spring from the ground. Yet man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward." That's Job 5, 2 through 7. The twisted theology of Eliphaz continues as he pretends to speak for God in the matter of wrath and judgment. And note that he sprinkles in truth with his lecture, but he misapplies it. He perverts it. We are warned against such false teachers in Acts 20, verse 30, and that from among your own number men will arise, perverting, that is, twisting the truth, to draw away the disciples after them. I mean, there's some truth in what Eliphaz is saying here. It's true that the wrath of God will be poured out upon the foolish man on Judgment Day. You know that foolish man, the one who has lived and died with the mantra, "There is no God." That's Psalm 14:1. And it's true, the wrath of God will be poured out on those who have set themselves up as their own God through envy. It was this kind of envy that resulted in the fall of Adam and Eve. Genesis 3:5 tells us, "For God knows that in that day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And it's also true that many unbelievers prosper in this life. That's the foolish taking root, as we read about in verse 3. Psalm 37:35 says, "I have seen the wicked in great power and spreading himself like a native green tree. Yet he passed away, and behold, he was no more. Indeed, I sought him, and he could not be found." I mean, these things are all true. But then, in what amounts to gross insensitivity, in addition to false teaching, Eliphaz attempts to speak for God as he recounts Job's personal losses, and he brings up Job's sons and daughters being crushed by a tornado, and the robbers taking all of his property. And he says, as if speaking for God, "I, God, cursed his," that is Job's, "dwelling place." Verse 3. And Eliphaz implies that this was no accident. Someone was behind these tragedies. They didn't just appear out of the dust, and that someone is God. And again, it's true that all things must pass through the hands of a sovereign God, but Eliphaz indicates that these tragedies against Job were brought on by some sin in his life. And he concludes this brief section with, "Yet man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward." Those sparks are nothing but the resistance to God's law, sin, and they fly upward to heaven, where God will deal with them by pouring out his wrath. I mean, what a dismal outlook on life. Eliphaz relegates life on this planet to nothing but law. There's no mention of God's grace, mercy, forgiveness as it concerns the sinner. No mention of a coming Messiah who will receive the wrath of God in the sinner's stead. Only an angry God dealing with sinners with any and all sorts of physical punishment that he can mete out in the here and now. I mean, waiting for the other shoe to drop from the hand of God, looking over our shoulders, that's no way to live. Martin Luther once said, "Be a sinner and sin boldly, but believe and rejoice in Christ even more boldly, for he is victorious over sin, death, and the world. As long as we are in this world, we have to sin. Sparks will fly upward, if you will. This life is not the dwelling place of righteousness, but as Peter says, we look for a new heaven and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." 2 Peter 3:13. It's enough that by the riches of God's glory, we have come to know the Lamb that takes away the sin of the world, John 129. No sin will separate us from the Lamb. That's a quote from Martin Luther. Yes, in this life we will have trouble, but to fear God solely because of his potential for pouring out wrath and punishing us is just plain foolish and unbiblical. You want a reason to fear God? Fear him because of his ability to forgive completely your sins against him. Psalm 134 says this, but there is forgiveness with you, with God, that you may be feared. I'm Dwayne Matson. That's today's Living Word.